I'm delighted to welcome Gautam Motwani, partner in human capital consulting at Deloitte Middle East. Gautam brings a truly global lens, having worked across India, United States, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. And today he advises CEOs, CHROs, and boards on some of the region's most complex people challenges, leadership readiness, national talent development, and preparing organizations for what's next. What I would value most about Gautam's perspective is that it's grounded, it's not theoretical HR, and it's based on what really is working in the fast scaling, high stake environments like the Middle East. So, Gautam, once again, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here.
It's a pleasure. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Gautam, just let's start with some context. You worked across multiple geographies, some mature, some emerging, and some highly regulated. And when now we look at Middle East specifically, now this is a market that's fast, diverse, and very relationship driven. So from your vantage point, having worked across India, US, Southeast Asia, and Middle East, what is fundamentally different about the HR and leadership landscape here?
That's a great question. I think as I reflect upon my experience across different geographies, there is one thing which strikes me the most, having spent the last 6 years in Middle East, which is the kind of vision and the kind of transformation agenda that the governments and the overall states have over here. So if you look at Saudi's Vision 2030, you have the UAE's Vision 2031, Qatar has its own vision. These are all very ambitious visions that they have, followed by and supported by equally ambitious transformation programs. What that then really means is that you've got to have the people, the talent, the workforce to be able to deliver those kind of transformation programs. And that's where the role of HR becomes very important within Middle East as compared to East, as compared to West. Because for the reasons that I've said, HR becomes very strategic in terms of being able to acquire, develop, and retain the kind of workforce which will enable that kind of transformation programs. And for that purpose, HR has, I would say, not just a seat at the table, but the front seat at the table. And in that context, HR becomes a very strategic function in Middle East as compared to any other part of the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And also, I feel the pace that Middle East operates, the kind of diversity of talent that we have here. So organizations here feel that leaders need to be ready before they feel that they are ready, because that's what just makes Middle East so special in itself as well. And that just brings me to another question, Gautam. One thing that we are consistently seeing that organizations by and large in Middle East don't have the luxury of long capability runways because leaders are expected to step up very quickly. Which brings me to priorities. Now, what are the top priorities for Middle East HR leaders today? That can be across attrition, capability building, readiness, some of the national programs, or perhaps a combination of all of these. What's your perspective here?
So I would say there are three major priorities from an HR leader's perspective. The first one is, like I said, to be able to drive the kind of transformation that we are seeing across the region and in different dimensions in all the industries and all the sectors which are present in the region. One thing which is the top priority for any CHRO is how do I acquire and how do I build the talent which will enable that kind of transformation. It's like you said, we need leaders who are ready today, who are ready as of yesterday. We don't have the luxury of time to enable and to prepare them for a change in the future. So, how do we acquire that kind of a talent? How do we basically build and retain that kind of a talent? I think that's the number one thing which is keeping CHROs awake at the night. The second one is having gotten that kind of workforce. Of course, the focus then shifts in terms of driving performance through that workforce. So, what is the kind of, let's say, high performance culture that we need to build? How do we go about basically, building up a culture which is also deeply rooted in learning and in capability building, not for the leaders themselves, but as well as for their own teams. that then basically becomes a very high priority agenda item for the CHROs. And I guess last but not the least is one of the things that you would have also probably seen is the business world has become quite complex, especially with the advent of AI. Interestingly, it's been just 3+ years since we had ChatGPT, which came into the main scene. And if you look at the kind of transformation which AI is driving, the kind of digital transformation which organizations are undertaking, the life of an employee is becoming more and more complex with every passing day, which then that means that there is a part of, or there's onus on the firm or on the organization in order to drive simplification and improve the employee experience, which will enable to better productivity, to better business outcomes and results. So that's also something basically which becomes a central part of the CHRO agenda. Because what at least I firmly believe is that HR as a function is the custodian of employee experience, irrespective of whether it is a digital or a physical employee experience. They need to be thinking about how do we simplify the life of our employees in this world which is becoming more complex with every passing day.
Yeah. And something you said really resonates, that the idea of leadership here, especially in this region, is expanding faster than the capability sometimes. Because we often say in the Middle East, speed to capability matters more than the perfect design. And of course, with the advent of AI, nationalization programs, there's a lot from a leadership capability perspective. Middle East organizations, Gautam, often grow as well as restructure very fast. So, how does this impact leadership capability needs? What's your take on this one?
That's very interesting, Shruti, and it was in fact one of the things which at least I found as quite interesting and challenging when I shifted into the region, which is it's not just about growth and restructuring, but it is a lot also about new organizations taking shape with every passing day. So you've got projects which get announced every single day. There are projects which get merged or acquired. There are organizations which are on ultra fast growth paths. And all of that brings in a lot of different dimensions, which basically leadership needs to adapt to as they move along this entire, indeed, fast paced environment. So I think, in my view, it flows from how do basically leaders think differently, act differently, and react differently. So if you're thinking from, let's say, cognitive perspective, leaders need to be open to the idea of possibilities. They need to embrace the fact that it is an ambiguous world. They may not have all the data, all the information to be able to take the right decisions, and they need to appreciate and they need to encourage divergent ways of thinking. If you're thinking about, let's say, how do they act differently, then this is about more so about a behavioral transformation, which is where we often think about how do you adapt to, let's say, shifting patterns of influence, because we know that the influence or the powers where the powers lie can shift very quickly within the kind of environment that we are seeing. How do we collaborate seamlessly across different teams? How do we make the best of our ecosystem, whether it is our vendors, whether it is our partners, whether it is other, let's say, players within our community? But then, more importantly, how do we also learn from our failures? And that's something basically which is a cornerstone in terms of what we call across as an agile leadership, which is critical and which is centered towards basically surviving and thriving in a transformation environment like this. Last, but probably one of the most important things is how do you basically internalize the fact that you are living with ambiguity? You are living in a world which is more VUCA than ever before.
Yeah.
How do you basically emotionally prepare your own self in terms of facing the ambiguity which basically lies ahead? How do you basically show resistance in the face of change? How do you basically accept that things will not go according to you all the time and brace up and bring up the confidence in terms of still basically picking up the battles and driving the change which is required to deliver on the agenda? So it requires, in my view, a different way of, let's say, thinking, acting, and reacting, right from, let's say, cognitive transformation for leaders, right up to an emotional transformation, just to brace themselves up for the whole change.
Correct. And that when happens, I think leaders are also in the current stage where all of us are operating, you are relearning and learning new things as well. And it's important that you are embracing all this. Of course, there might be cracks that show at specific transition points, but I think a good quality of a leader, it will be to be as agile as possible so that there is very minimal transition happening in the organizations. Yeah. And Gautam, where do you see the biggest performance gaps? And if I would just slightly tweak the question and ask specifically for some of the early career talent versus the first time managers. And this can be across, let's say, decision making, some level of stakeholder management, people leadership. But where do you see across these two pool of folks that we have, what would be the biggest gap today?
That's an interesting question, Shruti, and I've got probably a slightly unconventional viewpoint around that. So you said about early career talent and about first time managers. Early career talent is interesting because I don't think they have a lot of performance gaps. I think organizations have a lot of gaps in terms of how to extract the best and the maximum performance out of them. If you look at the early career talent, what excites them, what motivates them is very different to the generations which have passed by. This talent is driven by purpose, by the ability to craft something new, to craft something basically which will last, to experiment, to learn, to deliver the outcomes, but in a very different way. And I think it's imperative that organizations really learn in terms of how to get the maximum out of these talents. Like I was saying, that it's imperative that organizations actually learn how to make the best out of the early career talent, how to basically get the maximum out of their abilities, and recognizing that the way that organizations have functioned and the way that our generation has functioned, the new generation is not going to function that way. First time managers has always been a challenge, right from our time to the time still now. There are things which first time managers need to recognize that their role, which is being demanded out of them, will require far more influence, far more collaboration, and far more focus in terms of building their own teams in order to basically drive preparedness from a future standpoint. Now, I specifically picked upon these three areas because if you look at influence, right, we don't operate within our organizations today. All of us basically
Yeah.
operate in what we call across as an ecosystem. Ecosystem is built up with your clients, with your partners, with your vendors, with and we are also talking about an ecosystem of digital AI agents, right? So how do you basically work in a seamless fashion, which is basically cutting across all of basically these categories of, let's say, workers, whether it is freelancers, gig employees, or basically your partnerships within the ecosystem? And that requires a very different kind of influence as compared to yesteryears, where it is about basically just influencing either your peers or basically, let's say, your supervisors. Collaboration has become, I think, fundamentally critical towards how do we basically drive success nowadays. In fact, it's collaboration which is leading to success of organizations much more in Middle East as compared to competition. If you look at the way basically that, let's say, entities which belong to sovereign wealth funds are collaborating within each other, entities which, let's say, belong to banking ecosystems are collaborating with each other, the way basically that governments are essentially collaborating with each other, I think those are some very good case examples, which are probably seen just only in this part of the world. And that what that means from a manager's perspective is because that's the first step where he's going to learn that kind of a collaboration, right? That really needs to come across to light. I guess one of the things which has remained same since time memorial is that you become a manager, you've arrived in life, but then how do you basically prepare the next generation? That is a challenge which remains, and that needs to be a focus area for first-time managers as to how do they basically groom the next generation in a way where basically they can become inspirational leaders for them, and in a way basically where the next generation is ready to step on and take over newer challenges.
Very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing such a detailed breadth in terms of the perspective about how are leaders going through the challenge. And that actually brings me to the next section, which is more focused around and which is very specific to the Middle East context, multicultural leadership, Most leadership teams here aren't just diverse, they are deeply diverse. In fact, we would have probably at any given point of time 8 to 10, sometimes 12 nationalities in a single team. So, from your perspective and your experience, what are some of the most common leadership challenges when teams include so many nationalities and there's so much cultural context?
Let me try and answer that in a slightly different fashion. Let's keep the diversity from a nationality perspective aside for a moment. Let's take the scenario of mergers and acquisitions, right? Let's talk about two organizations coming together. Now, when two organizations come together, what are some of the biggest conflicts that you see? It's about communication, it's about holding yourself in higher regard than others, it's about not understanding others. It's about not being aligned to the common agenda. In a nutshell, and this happens when you have organizations who are coming together or when you have people who are coming from different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, nationalities who are coming together to hold on very tightly to your own identity. And that becomes the root cause of all kinds of communication, collaboration, working together, alignment issues. One of the things I think which we promote within our teams and which we've seen very successfully working within the region as well is to shift that needle from identity to purpose. What's the purpose basically which binds us together? How do we basically commonly, uniformly work towards that purpose? How can we leverage each other's strengths in terms of achieving that purpose? And how do we help each other in overcoming areas of weakness or areas of improvement towards delivering on that common purpose? So, to my mind, it's classic problems of communication, collaboration, alignment, which basically happen when it comes to diverse teams working together. But what really helps in terms of solving those problems is a common purpose. I personally got people from seven different nationalities in my direct reporting team. And I would say basically that it's been a leadership lesson for myself as well in terms of working with those people from diverse backgrounds. But I guess what's made us really successful is our joint purpose in terms of helping our clients build world-class HR organizations.
So, my takeaway would be the identity to purpose is the most common and the crux when you're dealing or when you're interacting with multiple nationalities and there's so much cultural context. And thank you so much for giving a slight different perspective, giving it from a lens of a mergers and acquisition lens. So, thank you. Gautam, we also often see that organizations are struggling with designing some specific leadership journeys that work well for both the nationals as well as the expats. And there will always be with this one group feeling that, oh, the program wasn't meant for them. So, what would be your a right way, in case there is, to blend nationals and expats in one leadership development journey?
I go back to my previous point again on this, Shruti. It has to be led by purpose. If your purpose is clearly defined, and if your cohort, and irrespective of what cohort you have, whether it is a mix of nationals and non-nationals, if they're all aligned on the same purpose, they will feel the usefulness and they will basically derive meaning out of the program. And we've done this basically in many contexts, which are multicultural contexts. That's always been the difference between the failure or the success of the program. If I were to give you like a few client examples, we had a client which is where they wanted to drive customer centricity as the clear purpose behind the leadership development program. Now, customer centricity is across the organization, right? It's not just the frontliners who are essentially interacting with the customers, but it's also the back-end people who are probably in charge of the processes, which will eventually determine what those customer-centric outcomes are. And therefore, when we brought the group together, and this was basically a mix of nationals and non-nationals, to the extent that they could identify and they could relate with the purpose of the program, I think they were engaged and they derived meaning out of the program. Whereas on other hands, even if let's say you have a very similar cohort, not too much diversity, either it is in terms of nationality, levels, or even thought process, if the purpose is not clearly defined, it doesn't really work. I think that's where basically leadership development programs are bound together by what we call across as red threads. Now, your red threads could be in terms of organizations becoming digital, organizations trying to drive customer centricity, organizations trying to have a better conflict resolution, or organizations where there is not enough conflict which is happening, which is important for the organization to succeed. As long as those red threads are clearly defined and those red threads, there's alignment on those red threads, you would have a very successful program.
Yeah, that's brilliantly put. And in fact, there's also a level of personalization that can be tweaked in any of the leadership development that just takes the journey for one person very different to another. And that's where I'll be now getting on to the next section, which is around coaching and leadership development. And perhaps I would want to go a slightly more deeper approach because there are no shortage of leadership programs in the region. But the kind of impact that each one of them creates is a complete different story. You would have seen multiple leadership initiatives internally, externally with the clients. So, in your view, what separates a meaningful leadership development from noise in the Middle East? Is it relevance? Is it, let's say, the facilitator credibility? What kind of ROI matrix, some measurement criteria? Or is it speed, since the region, and we touched upon this in the previous section as well, or is it the speed of impact? What's your take here?
I think that's all of those, but may I add a few more dimensions to it,
Absolutely.
Shruti? I think, to my mind, the first thing that we need to recognize and which becomes a key, so to say, factor to drive success is that leadership development programs are not an event, they are a process. It cannot be a one-time event where you have attended, let's say, a certain workshops, gone through certain amount of sessions, undertaken, let's say, a few pieces of work which are related to it, and then push, it's just gone. That never basically leads to success. It is an ongoing process which needs to be enabled by the organization, by the HR leaders, by the business leaders, and the participant themselves with whatever help is required from an external perspective. Any organization which has undertaken, let's say, programs which are, let's say, series of workshops, series of sessions, can only realize that much basically ROI from those programs. Because the moment you're out of those workshops, the learning is gone. Retention levels are probably 10%, 15%. Now, on the contrary, programs where you have regular interventions which are planned over a sustained period of time, and these interventions could be both internal and external to the organization. So let's say internal to the organization, regular check-ins basically with the business leaders, with the HR leaders, let's say regular measurements, whether it is in the form of a 360, people whom you appoint as your sounding boards, people whom you appoint as basically somebody who's going to observe you and give you feedback on your behaviors, on the way that you act, react, and emote. And externally, whether it is in the form of, let's say, coaches, external coaches, whether it is leadership coaches or whether it is mentors that you basically get in from the external world, the way that they guide you from the perspective of developing your capabilities, but then also delivering business outcomes, that makes the real difference. The other thing which I think, is important over here is leadership development programs tend to be very generic in the sense that, okay, let's talk about influencing. Let's talk about collaboration. Influencing and collaboration might mean very different things to organization A versus B versus C. And having those generic sessions and workshops and all of that doesn't really basically drives business impact. I think one thing is very clear when we are looking at our clients and when we are looking at the world of business that everybody is looking for business outcomes and they're looking for a real ROI. And therefore, your leadership development programs need to be structured, need to be designed in such a way that they deliver those business outcomes, they deliver the business ROI, which enables performance, like I said, performance for the organization and for those individuals to realize their true potential.
Yeah. And in fact, you've touched upon some references for my next question as well, that in the Middle East, leaders also have very little patience for generic frameworks, and they really want people who've been there. And especially if I talk about the context from a Middle East standpoint. since you touched upon coaching and mentoring as well. So, what mix, or I should say, what kind of cohorts benefit most from coaching? Would these be the first time managers, the senior leaders, or the CXOs? And why would you think that coaching would be more impactful and beneficial for this cohort?
I would say, Shruti, it's not so much so about the levels, really, whether it is a CXO or a first time manager or a senior leader. To me, this is about how do you basically realize true potential of any employee, right? And how do you drive performance for the organization? Now, you could be a first time manager or you could be a CXO. This is about basically bringing out your true potential. How do you basically adapt to change much better? How do you basically hone up your intellectual potential? How do you work with people better? How do you motivate your own self, like I said earlier, in the face of ambiguity better? Those are the kind of things which basically I think any kind of a coaching program delivers well. And to that extent, if the candidate, irrespective of the level, has a high potential, they should basically benefit from these coaching and mentoring programs. Of course, needless to say, and like I had mentioned before, they need to be rooted in business context. So it has to be basically embedded in your work, your day-to-day outcomes that you deliver, your business outcomes that you deliver, and it has to basically deliver an ROI for the organization. But yeah, true potential development is basically where it creates its maximum impact.
Yeah. And that's where I also feel that practitioner led coaching, whether it's across Middle East, Europe, US, or for that matter, Asia markets, leaders who've run the PNLs, who have led growth and transformation agendas, of course, add a lot of different perspective when you talk about specific performance coaching. And that's something that you cannot really replicate as well.
That is correct, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, it is all about value creation. And one could basically look at the PNL and drive value creation, right? But then how do you basically use your human capital, which is your biggest asset, to drive value creation? There's a lot of basically things which come across from experience, from people who've been there and done that, who can really help in terms of organization tap into that whole basic area of value creation.
Yeah, it's true. That brings me to the last section of the podcast today, Gautam. And we'll just take a zoom out perspective. We've touched upon AI, we've touched upon skills, leadership, capabilities, and the most popular and more contextual topic, the future of work in the Middle East when it comes to AI, skills, leadership. Between AI adoption, national transformation agendas, and these huge mega projects that are happening across the leaders, across the region, leadership expectations are changing at a supersonic speed. Looking ahead 3 to 5 years, what are some of the biggest shifts that you foresee in UAE's talent and leadership landscape? Would it be skills, decision-making speed, or just about leadership accountability, and or perhaps a combination of more and others? What do you think?
So I think three things top of the mind for me, Shruti. One, the transition has already started, but the transition is only going to be accelerated in the years to come, where we transition from, let's say, traditional line and function organizations to more of a skills-based organization, where you talk about what are the future skills which are required in order to create success for the organization, and how do we basically develop those future skills within our employees. How do we basically upskill and reskill our employees who perhaps have more declining part of the skills in order to basically become more forward looking and to create value for the organization. So that's one piece I think which is going to really take a shift. The second one is how do you basically prepare your talent to work in not just a multicultural, I think multicultural is something basically which this region is quite used to, but a multi-dimensional workforce. And what I mean by a multi-dimensional workforce is you have, let's say, a workforce which is not just your full-time employees, but basically your contractors, your partners, your vendors, but then also basically freelancers, the gig economy, and the digital workforce, which includes basically an army of AI agents, which is something which is going to happen to every single organization. And I guess the third thing is really in terms of how do you prepare your leaders to embrace a future which is unknown, which is ambiguous, yet is also basically room to open some of the highest ambitions and the visions that we've seen across the world.
Thank you. That was very practical insights that you've shared. Gautam, just one last question, and then before we wrap up this episode. If you are advising a CHRO in the UAE today, and he is someone who is preparing their leadership bench for 2030, what are the things that you will tell them to stop doing, and what is it that they should start doing immediately?
I think from the perspective of HR, Shruti, the transformation begins with the function itself. It's like we say the charity begins at home, right? So CHROs need to really think about how is it that they can transform their own function first. How is it that they can reimagine HR as a function with the advent of AI? What are the things where basically you really require and can really make the best of human intelligence versus what is it that what are those tasks, what are those things where basically you can always have an AI agent essentially driving those pieces of work for you. And that transformation of HR function is necessary for HR to add real and true value to business. That's where the elements around business partnership, around driving performance and learning, around building the right culture for the organization becomes much more pronounced as compared to what exists currently. So reimagination, transformation begins at home, and therefore CHROs really need to think about how is it that they can transform their own functions. The second one, like it said earlier, is to me, HR as a function is the custodian of employee experience. Employee experience is not driven by HR, but they're the custodians. The experience could be driven by, let's say, physical, digital, environmental factors. But that's where the role of HR as a function, the role of the CHRO needs to expand to think about, let's say, as an example, we've got a plethora of applications across the organization, each with a very different interface, with a very different experience. How is it that we can standardize? How is it that we can unify that kind of an employee experience? Probably give them a consumer grade experience. So employee experience becomes a very important part of HR and the CHRO's agenda. But then I guess last but not the least is really in terms of preparing the organizations and the people to embrace that future, building, acquiring, and retaining those essential transformational skills which will help in terms of delivering value for the organizations and move the countries, the nations forward towards a national agenda.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Gautam, that brings us to the end of the podcast today. And it's been such a grounded and insightful conversation. What really stood out for me is that the perspectives you shared about the leadership performance in Middle East. And it's not more about content or the programs, but it's all about transformation, how you're embracing, how you are building, acquiring, retaining, like you just shared in the last question. It's all about the speed, cultural intelligence, and a lot of real world credibility. Thank you once again for sharing your perspective and for such an honest conversation. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode of the VAS podcast. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.